I'd like to introduce the next chair, which is Hedley Auld. Hedley's been a friend of the Transport Institute for as long as I can remember, and a great supporter, a former executive with CN Rail, and now comfortably retired, I guess I'd say. So Hedley, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Good morning, everyone. In your conference program, this next session has been entitled Sustainable Aviation Fuels, but I suspect that our two panelists' presentations will in fact be broader in scope than this title might indicate. They'll be talking about new transportation fuels that emit less carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases over their life cycle, from production through processing and through the supply chain to end use, than traditional fossil-based transportation fuels, such as gasoline, diesel oil, or jet fuel. Our panelists will cover a range of new novel types of transportation fuels being introduced and used for surface transportation, marine navigation, and indeed for aviation. They are described variously as sustainable or low in carbon intensity, or clean or renewable fuels, and some simply as biofuels. Driven by the need to address climate change, rapid changes are taking place in this low carbon transportation fuel space. These include new government policies, regulations and incentives, new R&D, and significant new commercial investments. All these factors are speeding up the pace of adoption of clean fuels in the transportation marketplace. Higher biofuel consumption and production levels are spurring strong growth in North American demand for feedstocks, including new domestic markets for industrial use of oilseed crops grown and processed in Canada. So to talk about these changes, our panelists today are Fred Ghatala and Chris Vervaet. Each will make their presentation, and I think then we'll open it up for a question period. Please use the Zoom chat room to submit questions or comments you may have during their presentations. So first of all, Fred Ghatala is the Director for Carbon and Sustainability for Advanced Biofuels Canada. This is a national industry association established to promote the production and use of advanced biofuels in Canada. The association's members are global leaders in commercial production of advanced biofuels and technology development. This association also publishes a very useful annual report, Biofuels in Canada, that explains and tracks the impact of renewable and low carbon intensity fuel policies in Canada. Fred also has 13 years of experience in climate change policy and services. He leads the association's work to establish biofuel carbon value, life cycle analyses and regulations, and sector engagement in sustainability initiatives. He earned a bachelor's degree in finance from George Washington University and has an MSc from UBC, where his research focused on carbon policy. So please join me in welcoming Fred Ghatala to Fields on Wheels to speak to us today from his home base in Vancouver on the topic of Canadian clean fuel policy, current status and future directions.
Thank you so much, Hedley. Great to be here with everyone. I'm just going to flip over into share screen. Thanks for the introduction. Fred Ghatala, Director of Carbon and Sustainability with Advanced Biofuels Canada. I also chair our Sustainable Aviation Fuel Caucus, which is a group of our members that are specifically pushing on low carbon aviation fuel policy in the Canadian provinces at the federal level and learning from what's happening in other jurisdictions so that best practices can be brought to Canadian jurisdictions and adopted. So pretty broad presentation. I'll try to get through most of it. So here's our member slide. We're about 38 members now, about 45 billion liters of global installed low carbon fuel capacity. So we are everything ranging from traditional or conventional methyl ester biodiesel through to renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel, advanced renewable fuels that say, for example, ferment flue gas and turn it into ethanol. Lots of pathways, lots of ways to make low carbon fuels. We began as the Alberta and British Columbia Biodiesel Associations expanded to become the Western Canada Biodiesel Association, now much bigger canvas with Advanced Biofuels Canada. Diverse technologies and products within our membership. So a key part that I draw here, because I just went through some of the main low carbon fuels like renewable diesel, biodiesel, etc. It's all of the co-products that come out of the low carbon fuel production facilities. We've got everything from glycerin that's a byproduct of biodiesel production, animal feed, which can be a recipient market for glycerin, but everything from renewable naphtha that comes out of the renewable diesel production process, and that is a gasoline blend stock now. So the bioeconomy is alive and well in the production platforms of many of the low carbon and synthetic renewable fuels that are being produced. So we exist to push on policy. We focus on gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and heating oil. So we are predominantly a liquids-focused organization. Of course, members have projects that put renewable content into the gaseous and solid streams, but it's all about policy. These low carbon fuel options, they need to be pulled into the market, and what pulls them into the market is policy that makes room for them within the transportation fuel mix. And then once there's room for these different fuels to have a footing in the market, then we progress down the cost curve, then we get economies of scale, then we find additional value-added co-products, and we participate in broad-scale decarbonization of transportation fuels. On our website, I'll just flash up a couple of resources that we have. If you are interested in learning a lot more about Canadian renewable and low carbon fuels, please visit the website. We've got dashboards, we've got reports, we've got Power BI enabled graph sets that are very useful, because Canada is not the US in terms of having the same access to information like the Energy Information Agents Administration, EIA, puts out on a weekly, daily basis. Canada doesn't have it, so we've stepped in to try to make the most information available as possible. Here is the key slide of where we're at in Canada. So you've got provinces. I'm a dual citizen, US, Canada. One of the first things I learned when I moved to Canada is that the provinces are extremely strong in their domain over energy and environmental policy, way more than many of the United States. Some would say California, a bit of an exception, but provinces generally have a lot more domain over energy and environmental policy, which is why we see a really useful patchwork of different types of low carbon fuel policies across Canada. Why is a patchwork useful? Generally, you don't say like patchworks are useful, but in the fuel space, they are quite useful because you have different manners of implementing policy that best reflect the priorities of the jurisdiction. And there's a lot of learning from your neighbors. Some of the policies, like the renewable content requirements in Ontario and Quebec, those have renewable fuel standards with greenhouse gas modifiers to basically sum it up. Whereas in BC, you have a low carbon fuel standard that just earlier this week, they updated the regulation for it to get to 30% below 2010 levels by 2030. So significant progress with that CI schedule. So what you have here is red is renewable content requirements in gasoline, reverse. Red is renewable content in diesel, blue is renewable content in gasoline. Bold numbers reflect the CI reduction if it's a low carbon fuel standard. In Alberta, they have a minimum greenhouse gas threshold in order for a fuel to be eligible. That's 25% below the fossil baseline. That's why they're in parentheses. You'll see Saskatchewan and Manitoba, straight up blend mandates. There are no greenhouse gas modifiers in that program. And you'll see in Ontario and Quebec, you have minimum thresholds that affect the amount of compliance value that low carbon fuels and gas and diesel provide to the obligated party. Federally, clean fuel regulation is one of the most significant things that a lot of folks in the Canadian clean fuel space spent the last 7 years participating in the development of. It has a carbon intensity reduction schedule for diesel, gasoline. Previously, it did include jet fuel and heating oil and heavy fuel oil within regulatory scope. Now it's just gas and diesel, but those other types of low carbon fuels can generate in credit creation. I've got airplanes there. What does that mean? It means that jet fuel is an eligible source of compliance credit generation in the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec. British Columbia, with their new updated regulation, does obligate now a carbon intensity reduction in jet fuel, also mandates renewable content in jet fuel. That is the first aviation-focused renewable fuel policy to take effect in Canada that puts obligatory requirements on that fuel mix. I will just take a moment here to give you a 101 on renewable jet fuel. It is the new entrant on the block in terms of low carbon fuels, but here's the key point. It is jet fuel. The renewable is just characterizes where the carbon comes from, but it is the same as jet fuel, which means that when SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, which is one of its terms, when it is certified against ASTM D7566, and then when it is blended with petroleum jet fuel that's certified to D1655, when you get that blend recertified to the ASTM 1655 spec, it is jet fuel, which means that it's entirely fit for purpose, and you can use it up to the blend limits that are established in the ASTM specification, which for the predominant type of sustainable aviation fuel is 50%. There are a number of pathways to produce sustainable aviation fuel. As anyone who understands a bit of chemistry, you'll know that lipids are basically three kerosene molecules tied together. So you can use industrial processes to create renewable diesel, renewable jet fuel, all kinds of things that work in that use a distillate-based kerosene type molecule. You can make them out of many different materials. And so that's why the pathway that is bold here, which is HEFA, hydrotreated esters and fatty acids, is the predominant pathway in existence and in use now. And it would be the one where Canada probably has the most opportunity for impact because of our oilseed production strength. Zoom in on British Columbia. It's got a carbon intensity reduction requirement for jet fuel, which is right here, 10% CI reduction by 2030. And it's got a renewable content requirement step up from 1% beginning in 2028 to 3% in 2030. It's breaking news because the reg is out this week. It was released by order in council. It was approved by cabinet last week, most likely, and published earlier this week on the OIC website. So that's major. We see the obligated market being about 66 million liters in 2030. But if the carbon intensity reduction for jet fuel was to be met purely by sustainable aviation fuel, we would be about 10 to 12% in 2030. Because of the low carbon fuel standard policy structure, debits created from fossil fuels can be covered by credits from many different sources: renewables and gas, renewables and diesel, renewables and jet fuel. So it adds aviation fuel into the denominator of that policy. So here's what it looks like. British Columbia has an opt-in for 2 years, next year and the following year. CI reductions then start in 2026, and the volume requirements occur in 2028, 29, and 30. We forecast that the provinces of Ontario and Quebec maintain an opt-in eligibility, Saskatchewan as well, opt-in eligibility, and that Canada, there's a lot of working groups going on right now regarding sustainable aviation fuel at the federal level. So given that aviation fuel was in scope for the CFR, given that the Minister Alghabra and part of the action plan for aviation decarbonization 2 years ago, Transport Canada put up with consultation with industry a 10% SAF use target by 2030. So a lot of work to see what could be done to bring that into effect. Yesterday, ABFC gave a webinar called Canada's Biofuels Surge. I've lifted a couple slides from here because I think they really hit home the amount of penetration we see in low carbon fuels in Canada. So you see a bit of a COVID flat spot, and then we're picking up in 2022 with estimated numbers. We got ethanol, biodiesel, HDRD. For the first time, the Biofuels in Canada report includes co-processed fuel, and we quantify the amount of gasoline displaced by electricity. You can see an increase in renewable content, not just coming out of COVID, but relative to since the report series started with 2010 data, we see a strong uptick in low carbon fuel use. And one of the reasons why is we see more renewable fuels being used than are required by the sum of provincial regulations. And that just happened recently. So what is that? That's likely the effect of the federal clean fuel regulation pulling in more renewable fuels to generate more compliance credits that help the primary suppliers who are obligated under the regulation prepare for reducing their carbon intensity through the regulation. So the CFR at a federal level is really pulling what we see, the data suggests, is pulling more renewable fuels into the market, certainly on the gasoline and diesel side, because sustainable aviation fuel participates in the federal clean fuel regulation from credit generation. We expect it to also pull SAF into the federal picture, also supported by BC's LCFS that obligates jet fuel. Key part, we are living in the age of affordability where that is absolutely top of political concerns. This shows the net impact of cumulative renewable fuel blending on prices across Canada. You see on the gasoline side, a wholesale cost reduction. There's, of course, taxes. These include carbon taxes that are levied on gasoline and diesel. In Quebec, there's an avoided cap and trade cost. So when you net all of that together, it's about a 0.01% increase in fuel cost due to the sum of renewable fuels being used in Canada. And that slight cost is because of the diesel side. Diesel, renewable alternatives to diesel are slightly more expensive. Ethanol is a cheaper molecule than gasoline, especially when you include the octane benefit. We've got a lot of room for growth in Canada with an expanding clean fuel sector, many emission reductions, new high quality jobs, economic growth, and a cost of measures to unlock this investment that is positioning Canada's sector to be competitive with US renewable fuel production under the US Inflation Reduction Act. That is a strong focus on what the sector that includes the refining sector are looking at to try to have enabled through federal policy that makes Canadian production competitive to the US. I'm just going to zoom over the clean fuel regulations. Very significant policy. One of the key parts of it is the land use and biodiversity criteria, which is useful in the sense that it insulates the regulation from perceptions that it can promote unsustainable renewable fuels. Renewable fuels are very tied to the agricultural system. The level of tracking, slight data requirements, confirmation that the crops are grown under the rule of law in Canada serve to differentiate crops from the Canadian agricultural sector from those that may be imported from jurisdictions where there's less adherence to requirements for environmental performance when crops are grown. ABFC's website has a number of materials on it that show basically the real-time trade balance of where Canadian renewable fuels are. So we have exports in the dark brown bar, imports in the dark blue bar, and this shows that for renewable fuels total, we are largely import dependent. Much of that is from US corn-based ethanol that is the predominant supply of renewables in the gasoline pool. We export a fair amount of fuel, especially on the biodiesel side to the United States. But that's our trade balance that we keep updated in real time. We drill down a bit to show where the imports are actually coming from. The U.S. Gulf Coast is the site of many new or more renewable diesel production facilities. So we're able to pull fuel from the US Gulf, renewable diesel, into Canada. That's supplying a lot of our market now. Of course, there's an intent to have domestic clean fuel production capacity. We have new facilities being stood up here that are here. Just a little quick tour through my slide deck to make everyone dizzy. But the ones that are stood up now are obviously Parkland with their co-processing, Tidewater, the Bria Renewable Fuel Facility in Come By Chance. Those are all large renewable diesel projects that are positioned to supply the Canadian market with domestic production. So carbon tax reform is a major area that Advanced Biofuels Canada is focusing on. The carbon tax currently applies to, in the province of British Columbia, applies to renewable fuels in addition to the fossil fuels that they displace. So what we have is a calculator that shows, because carbon taxes and even excise taxes, they're applied volumetrically. When you have clean fuels, and in the case of ethanol, that has a slight energy density difference. That is one of the key parts that we
just lost your screen there.
Yeah. Are you seeing anything now? I think my finger slipped and I hit a button, which is fine because I was just wrapping up.
We can see you, Fred, but not the slides.
Perfect. That's I gave my slides the proverbial hook, I guess. So anyway, instead of fumbling around, I'll just state that what is the rationale for low carbon intensity fuels as we progress towards 2030, especially as we have zero emission vehicle mandates being put in place provincially, also federally. What's the role for low carbon intensity fuels if we're all going to be driving EVs very soon? And the answer to that is transportation emissions are such a significant source of emissions. They're a beast. And we've got to use all available tools to tackle that source of emissions. So that does include zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles. It also includes decarbonizing the fuels that we're using in the internal combustion engine cars right now. We don't have enough time to wait for fleet turnover to be the key to unlocking decreased emissions in the transportation sector. So that's why our members produce fuels. They produce fuels in response to policy, and it's up to the policymakers to recognize the role that decarbonizing the internal combustion engine plays in helping us reach the significant emission reduction targets we have. So I don't want to take any time from my co-panelist. Chris Vervaet is fantastic in speaking and slides. So Hedley, maybe I'll pass it back to you, and then I'll stand by for questions after we finish all the presentations.
That's fine, Fred. I think what I'll do is just, let me see if I can interpret for the audience here, many of whom might be new to this whole field, some of the abbreviations that you've used in here. And I've had to get up to speed over the last couple of days since we spoke about this topic area. Let's go back just to the very beginning. I think of biofuels beginning with ethanol mandates in the US, and which led to a real ramp up in corn ethanol production, and really created a new market for US corn producers who had traditionally been supplying the food market and the feed market. The industrial use market suddenly just really grew. But what was the mechanism that drove ethanol back 10 to 15 years ago? Was it the mandates at the federal or state level?
A lot of it was for displacing MTBE that was put in as an oxygenate. Also, finding octane. Ethanol is a great source of octane that is very price competitive or below other petroleum-based octanes. But yes, much of the ethanol production capacity was stood up to supply the US renewable fuel standard market and then the RFS2. some of the earlier volumes in the US market were from Brazilian sugarcane ethanol, but then corn and ethanol production really advanced and became extremely efficient. Started with thermal coal being the main process heat, now natural gas, and now you have ethanol facilities using carbon capture and sequestration. But yeah, I think where you started, Hedley, these are policy-driven markets. Our transportation fuel mix has been exclusively, really, since, I mean, horses and buggies, fossil fuels. And so this represents diversifying the fuel supply through requiring low carbon fuels to be used.
Now, the statistics that you were showing that in gasoline across Canada, there are volumetric mandates set by province that vary province to province. It looked like, for example, in Manitoba, it was as high as 10% is the mandated ethanol content. It goes as high as perhaps 15% in the US. Like there's an upper limit as to what gasoline could take within automobiles or within the supply chain itself. Is that correct?
You're seeing a lot of E15 now. That is the next step for ethanol. E10 is pretty much across the board, but you can get to E15. Of course, there's E85 stations and flex fuel vehicles available to use that higher content of fuel. The Brazilian hydrous and anhydrous ethanol markets have gotten significantly past the E15 level. So there's a bit of engine design that has to occur on the ethanol side. Renewable diesel, why you've seen it take off so much is that it is diesel fuel. There's no changes required. But creating these markets for renewable fuels, it doesn't just change the fuel production process. It has led to a increase in production, increase in efficiency on the agricultural sector side. And so what you'll see is modern renewable fuel policies like the federal clean fuel regulations, they require that the production not come from expanding land use at the expense of grasslands and forests. The European Union's Renewable Energy Directive started that approach. The US Renewable Fuel Standard incorporated it, and the Canadian CFR also has it. These policies aren't designed to encourage the clearing of additional land, which is why you have things like the land use and biodiversity criteria in effect.
Let's step through that then. Again, you were saying that Canada has adopted just in the last year the clean fuel standard regulations, which themselves were modeled on, shall we say, a British Columbia model. And then in turn, really the pioneer in this was California then. And can you explain how it works? How is carbon intensity measured, and what are the targets set? And then what are the compliance credit mechanisms that work in these?
Big question. The carbon intensity is the currency of low carbon fuel regulations. What they require is that you reduce the carbon intensity, which is expressed as grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of fuel. Liter of diesel, like 36 megajoules of energy. You need to reduce the carbon intensity per megajoule of fuel, which is a really efficient way to design a policy because it keeps the metric constant. A liter of gas versus diesel versus jet, different energy content. So you basically have to reduce that through blending renewable fuels, renewable diesel, biodiesel, ethanol. Also, you can create credits from installing and operating EV chargers, co-processing, where you put renewable content into a refinery. And there's pathways. The BC LCFS website has a lot of this detail, but there's pathways that use hydrogen, RNG, CNG, basically anything that reduces the amount of emissions from transportation fuels is generally eligible to create credits under the policy. It is what seems to be the pervasive modern approach to low carbon fuel introduction through policy means.
And we're newly into this at the federal level. Is there any evidence now of the supply or the demand for compliance credits that has come out so far, or is it just too new?
Another very good one. So ECCC has not published official credit balance statistics. The first official report is coming July 31st, 2024. They have presented in webinars what the estimated credit balance is based on approved carbon intensity scores. Initial reports are that the market is functioning. Credit prices are what we hear in the 100 to 250 per ton dollar range. Of course, those may be marginal credit transactions, meaning that not all compliance is achieved through purchasing and selling credits. Renewable fuel purchasers that blend the fuel aren't going out to the credit market to buy credits, right? So it's not necessary that the credit in estimated value reflects the cost or the price of renewable fuels or credit creation. Rather, it's the value that the marginal credit is able to achieve from the market, because primary suppliers may not be blending the renewable fuels at present compared to the amount of compliance obligation they forecast coming their way in a couple of years. I think I just confused myself with that, but basically the market is working. There are no published prices, but the trade is very active.
Let's just stop there, and then let's just bring on our other speaker, Fred, and just if you'll stand by, because we'll continue with the question and answer afterwards. It's pretty clear that the efforts to reduce carbon emissions will have an impact on agriculture directly and indirectly, notably by increasing opportunities for oilseed crops grown and processed for industrial use. So to talk about this, our second panelist is Chris Vervaet. Chris is the Executive Director of the Canadian Oilseed Processors Association, or as we know it, COPA in Western Canada. He represents its member companies on matters pertaining to the oilseed processing industry. Chris is also a senior executive with the Canola Council of Canada and provides leadership on topics impacting all segments of the canola value chain. Before joining COPA and the Canola Council, Chris spent several years with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, including a posting as an agricultural counselor in the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Earlier, he worked for the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and for Bunge Global. He is a native Manitoban. He earned his BSc in agribusiness from the University of Manitoba and an MSc in agricultural economics from the University of Guelph. And his work with COPA and the Canola Council has focused on growth opportunities and challenges in the canola industry as the world transitions to a lower carbon future. He leads the value chain's efforts on renewable fuels, working closely with government and industry partners on key regulatory initiatives, including Canada's new clean fuel regulation and the US renewable fuel standards. So again, please welcome Chris Vervaet to Fields on Wheels, speaking us today from his home base in Winnipeg on the topic oilseed processing overview. So Chris, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Just great, thanks.
And thank you for having me again for Fields on Wheels. It's been a few years since I last presented. And Barry, when I first provided you with the title of my presentation, I've had an opportunity to make it a little bit more catchy and relevant to the discussion for this panel. So this is what I'm going to be presenting today. It's really going to be focused on crush expansion in Canada and the shifting utilization of canola and what that means to the trade flows. So I have about 10 slides I'm going to walk everybody through. So this slide just outlines the footprint of canola processing in Canada. So currently we have 14 facilities in Canada, spanning as far east as Quebec and as far west as Alberta. All of these facilities do process canola. And approximately the capacity in 2023 was about just north of 11 million metric tons of canola processing. I should note that the plants that are out east in both Quebec and in Ontario process soybeans as well. But the focus of my presentation will be very much on canola because that is where we see our biggest footprint, and it's also where we see the biggest growth opportunities for our industry. So when we look out over the next 5 years, we see some significant expansion of processing on the horizon. Over the last 3 years or so, there have been 5 new investments announced by the member companies that are listed at the bottom. All of these investments have been announced in Saskatchewan for canola processing. That's not by accident. Saskatchewan happens to be the province where most of the canola in Canada is grown. So the farmers in Saskatchewan represent about 50% of all of the canola production grown in this country. Saskatchewan is also very ideally located from a central logistical point of view. So access to both east and west and south market destinations are quite convenient from Saskatchewan. So if all of these new investments that have been announced come to fruition and they're built, stated on the capacity that was announced in the various press releases, we see capacity growing by roughly 7 million metric tons. So that's 60% increase from what we see today, reaching about 18 million metric tons of processing capacity over the next 5 years or so. And that would bump our total footprint of facilities from 14 to 17. This slide kind of provides a little bit of context in terms of where we've come from back about a decade or more ago to where we are today, and then where we think we're going to be in 2025 and onwards as it relates to canola processing and what that means from a relative point of view for production as well. So back in 2010, we had production of canola of around 13 million metric tons. And our crush was approximately half of that, about 6 million metric tons of crush. Over the years, we've seen steady growth of both production and crush. And essentially what's happened is as production has increased, we've seen more value-added processing come online. And really what's been interesting is that it's always been around half of production. So whether you're looking out at 2010 or you're fast forwarding to 2022, about half of what was grown in Canada was processed in Canada. But as per my previous slide, we see some pretty big shifts coming our way in the industry as it relates to expansion. So taking a bit of a guess here, so I don't want people to take these numbers to the bank. We're always making estimates as economists and policy analysts to see what might be possible in the future. So that's what that last set of bar charts on the right-hand side are. They're just estimates of what we think could be possible. So we might see 23 million tons of production of canola by 2025 or a bit later. And then the capacity that I talked about on the other slide, if we do see all the investments come to fruition, we could see crush reach about 16 million metric tons. And that would represent about 70% of what is produced in Canada. And as per my previous comment, this is significant. We've always been around half. So to move to 70% of value-added production in Canada really is a significant step change for the industry with many positive benefits as it relates to, again, more of that value-added processing occurring here in Canada, more delivery options for farmers. And I'm now going to unpack the benefits from the point of view of being a feedstock provider in low carbon fuels. So Fred already provided, I think, a really good overview of renewable fuels, what they are, how they're made. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail on those aspects, but only wanted to highlight, again, a bit of a guesstimate from our point of view where we see demand for both bio and renewable diesel going in the years ahead. My discussion on some of these subsequent slides are going to focus primarily on biodiesel and maybe even more so on renewable diesel. I think I heard Fred say the distinguished piece or the differences between those fuels, but maybe just for the benefit of everybody, biodiesel is more of that traditional renewable product that came online in significant scale, I'd say probably about 10 or 15 years ago. The new kid on the block is renewable diesel. It is not the same as biodiesel. Renewable diesel is a 100% drop in fuel. So it is chemically indistinguishable from fossil fuel. So when we talk about biodiesel and we talk to our farmers and we talk to some of those that use diesel, there is often some limitations to biodiesel. A 5% blend rate, maybe a maximum 10% blend rate if you're doing it in some warmer climates. Those types of challenges or issues do not exist with renewable diesel. Renewable diesel, again, is a 100% drop in fuel. So if you're running your tractor on fossil diesel today, you can replace that fossil diesel 100% with renewable diesel. So not to belabor that point, but I think it's important to distinguish these two products. And again, the renewable diesel being the new kid on the block and where we see a lot of opportunities for future growth. And that's what the chart on the right-hand side is intended to demonstrate. And this is both between Canada and the US. My presentation is going to focus on opportunities on both sides of the border. So we see a sharp increase based on that graph I just put up on the screen as it relates to the increase in demand for biodiesel and renewable diesel, again, with an emphasis on renewable diesel. This is what the build out of renewable diesel production capacity looks like in both Canada and the United States. So in Canada, there have been 7 facilities, probably more, but these are the 7 facilities that I know of or that I have found in terms of public information that are either already built or are under construction or are being considered for construction. If everything gets built the way that they've been announced in their press releases and from public information sources, we could see 4 billion liters of capacity of renewable diesel in Canada in the next 4 to 5 years. To put that into some context, it's almost zero today. There's one facility, the one that's on the far left there with the green dot, Tidewater, that has recently commissioned their renewable diesel plant, the first one in Canada. But there's a lot of potential for increases. I think Fred mentioned one of the companies, Brea, which is on the far right-hand side of our country in Newfoundland. That facility is under construction. We have Imperial Oil's facility that's also under construction. So there's a lot of potential to get close to that 4 billion liter capacity in the years ahead. Now, just to turn your attention to the right-hand side of the screen, and this is always the case when we talk about the United States, it's always on such a bigger scale. The build out of capacity for renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel in the United States is nothing short of remarkable. All those dots that you see peppered on the continental United States there represent where renewable diesel facilities either already exist or are under construction. So more than 25 facilities are already operating or are under construction in the United States, representing approximately 30 billion liters of capacity. So the production of renewable diesel in North America is really starting to take off. So I've thrown up a bunch of numbers, right? Billions of liter here, billions of liter there. I'm going to try to put it into perspective in terms of what that means for feedstock. So this particular slide shows what one renewable diesel facility would require notionally if they were going to source 100% of their feedstock supplies from canola. So here's a facility that has an annual production capacity of 1 billion liters. Sounds like a big number, doesn't it? 1 billion liters for one facility. But that is not at all unusual when you look at some of the different facilities that are being constructed today in both Canada and the United States. There's several facilities that have that type of production capacity today or have that type of production capacity in terms of intent for the years ahead. So 1 billion liters, again, let's say they're sourcing 100% of their feedstock from canola, would require approximately 1 million metric tons of canola to feed that plant. That would be equivalent roughly again to about 3 crush plants, kind of a standard size crush plant that you would see in Canada today. And when you take that back down to the farm level, that would be equivalent to approximately 2.5 million metric tons of seed. So I hope this adds a little bit of perspective in terms of how big of an opportunity the renewable diesel boom could be for feedstock providers and for farmers in the years ahead. So just to provide a snapshot of canola utilization in renewable fuels. And again, I'm focusing here just in terms of canola that is grown and harvested in North America, trying not to distinguish between Canada and the US. In fact, it's hard to distinguish between Canada and the US because the data is hard to come by. So I'm aggregating, Canada and the US in terms of canola utilization in renewable fuels here. So again, in 2022, we see about 2.5 million tons of seed equivalent that find their way into the renewable fuels market. The US is the largest market in 2022. We see the EU and their biofuel program still taking some canola from Canada. And then we see Canada there in red. If you fast forward to 2030 and all of the biofuel programs and regulations continue to strengthen, and there's still the political will to decarbonize transportation fuels through renewable fuels, we expect to see a lot of growth in both Canada and the United States. In fact, we see nearly a 300% increase potentially with regards to canola that is used in renewable fuels by 2030. Again, I want to put some of this into perspective. So that's what the right-hand side of the slide is intended to do. We're not stagnant. Things don't stay the same. So we're not going to continue to see production of canola stay the same. We do anticipate opportunities for increased productivity. We see opportunities for cover cropping of canola in places in the United States. So as an industry broadly, regardless if we're in Canada or the United States, we're optimistic that we're going to see an increase in production of canola in the years ahead. And what we've done here again is take a guesstimate out to 2030, we could see canola production increase by about 10 million tons, reaching 30 million tons by 2030. And if we're going to be incorporating more of our canola into renewable fuels, we see that maybe being about 25% of production by 2030. Leaving 75% still being utilized by our, let's call it, traditional markets of food and feed. So the point of the slide on the right-hand side is really to emphasize that the fuel opportunity is coming and we're excited about it. There's a lot of good things that are going to happen for our value chain as a result of it. But our food and feed markets aren't going anywhere. They're going to continue to be the dominant market where canola flows to. So just a quick snapshot of historical disappearance of Canadian canola. Again, I'm taking the US out of this equation just for a second and focusing on Canadian canola. Over the last 5 years, again, it's pretty even Steven in terms of where canola production goes. About half gets crushed and half is exported to markets around the world. When we look at the situation for meal and oil disappearance in terms of where those products flow, it's still predominantly going towards exports, which is indicated by the orange pie. And the blue pie is where we see our domestic market picking up the slack. You fast forward in terms of that outlook I keep talking about, the 5-year outlook. If we see all the crush capacity come online and we see them utilizing the capacity to the best that they can, roughly 16 million metric tons of seed would be crushed. We have 7 million metric tons of exported. This is based on an assumption that we get 23 million metric tons by around the 2025 time period. So a substantial shift. Again, this is picking up from basically the second slide I presented and just showing that we're going to be a bigger piece of the pie as it relates to the crushing of canola here in Canada. When we look again at the disappearance, where is that oil and meal going to go? Really, we don't see a significant change. There's definitely going to be a bigger market opportunity in Canada for canola oil. So the actual gross tonnage of our domestic market will increase, again, primarily because we see opportunities for canola oil and renewable fuels in Canada. But really, the distribution doesn't change much. The punchline really is that exports are still going to be our bread and butter. It's going to be something that our entire value chain still relies on heavily. Okay, a couple more slides here, and I'd be remiss if I didn't unpack a bit on the logistics of, changing trade flows and things of that nature. So this is how we view things changing in the years ahead. The yellow arrows depict more canola oil moving to the US and Canada, again, primarily being driven by demand for renewable fuels. We're going to have a lot more meal on our hands once all this crush capacity comes online. We don't think that we see that canola meal finding a home in either Canada and the United States. There's certainly a potential for some more volumes to move to both Canada and the US destinations for meal, but ultimately it's going to have to find a home offshore. And when we say offshore, we're talking about Asia. So that's what the brown line depicts, the movement of the canola meal, likely through ports like Vancouver and perhaps Prince Rupert as well. What we're going to see is less seed exports. So we'll still see seed exports, again depicted in dark gray, going off the West Coast primarily, but it's going to be less than what we've been used to in the years previous. So to round out my presentations, and again, recognizing this is a conference that is intended to talk a little bit about the aspects of logistics and supply chains, I just thought I'd throw up some bullets here to talk about some implications, and hopefully it precipitates a little bit of discussion amongst the attendees as well. So I think it's been clear from my slides that more canola as oil is going to be shipped to North American destinations, which does have an added benefit of reducing pressures at port locations. Something that I've heard at this event actually in the past is that we've got congestion issues in port destinations such as Vancouver. If we keep more of the canola as oil in North America, that could alleviate some pressure there. But there is a however to that comment. To my earlier mention of canola meal, it's going to need to find a home. So we're still going to have to move a heck of a lot of meal off the West Coast. North American destinations for oil have both shorter and longer hauls. A lot of folks that I speak to on this topic of expanded crush will often mention, boy, that's great. We're going to have this market in our own backyard. You'll be shipping canola oil to a renewable diesel customer that's maybe only 50 kilometers, maybe as short as 10 kilometers. This is going to be a massive efficiency. I say yes to that. So that is definitely an opportunity and an interesting aspect of more efficient movement of canola oil, for example. But some of our US shipments and some of our US customers on renewable diesel could be as far as 3,000 kilometers away. So Fred mentioned that there's a real mix and a concentration of renewable diesel facilities in the US Gulf. Those are going to be some of our customers. There's different modes of shipment, of course. We could use barge. There's different ways to get the product there. But if we were going to use rail, that would be a 3,000 kilometer trip one way from central Saskatchewan, for example. So yes, there's going to be efficiencies on shorter hauls, but there's still going to be a lot of long hauls for our product to get to market. Maybe just the last comment here, less seed exported through the West Coast means less unit trains. So unit trains is something that often gets talked about even on this conference, and how that's been such a boon with regards to efficiencies. Can't argue with that. So maybe we don't have as much of those efficiencies because we're now moving value-added products. But meal exports, especially if we're going to be moving it to the coast, that's still going to be moved by unit trains largely. We don't see that changing. And there's also opportunities for larger car blocks of oil. All of our oil shipments traditionally have gone through manifest in smaller blocks. But if we see some of these large customers come online that are requiring large volumes at a time, I think there's still some efficiency gains by moving oil in larger blocks. And perhaps we might even see our first unit train of oil one of these days. So I think I've spent at least more than my allotted time, Hedley, on the subject, but I do hope there's time for a question or two.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's an outstanding presentation. It really covers many bases. I'm just going to turn to the chat room. There have been some questions coming through specifically on sustainable aviation fuel. Question to Fred from Robert Parsons. Do you see that, Fred? In the near term, sustainable
Yes.
aviation fuel based on oilseed appears to be the most realistic option to decarbonize aircraft. Availability has been the issue, but now appears to be more of the niche requirements, including more stringent regulatory concerns and compliance. And at your meeting yesterday, the data shows new production is coming online, but little of that appears to be going towards sustainable aviation fuels. What additional incentives or policy improvements may be needed to get more activity towards sustainable aviation fuels? Fred?
Dr. Parsons, thank you for the question. That's absolutely correct. Renewable diesel production is the predominant focus of the new projects. That's because there are regulations that require the renewable diesel. SAF or low carbon jet is the new entrant. So we see policy creating that firm demand is one of the key parts to bring in more SAF production. Remember, SAF can be produced from the same production platform as renewable diesel, slightly different distillation, different isomerization. You just need a slightly shorter molecule. Once you have an RD plant, doesn't take tremendously more capital to swing it to upwards of 90% SAF. So we see RD as being the first phase and then SAF being the second phase. Many of the projects have announced it as such. I'll just hit your other question here, Robert. Thanks for pointing out the CGSB versus ASTM. Absolutely correct. CGSB points to the ASTM spec, especially for 7566 synthetic aviation fuels. So that's a good point out.
There's another question here earlier from Paul Larson, and I think that you were, Fred, you were possibly anticipating his question. Is the argument that crops should be used to produce food and not fuel in a world of increasing food security still in play? And I gather that what you were saying in one of your slides about low quality land, and that a factor that is taken into account, is it correct, that in the carbon intensity calculations, the scorecarding of substitutes is the land that is taken into account as well, but there's also this competition for food acreage, if you will.
Should have a webinar just on this issue. Food versus fuel is a pervasive piece. Ever since the commodity super cycle in 2008, when a lot of funds went into the commodity markets, that issue is inextricable from renewable fuel development. I generally go, and everyone will know this, it's not food or fuel, it's always food and fuel. You look at the main agricultural feedstocks that are used for bioethanol, renewable diesel, biodiesel, you always have meal coming out the back end of those facilities, whether it's dried distillers grains, whether it's canola meal, etc. So these are projects and programs that use a part of the agricultural production. I mean, on the ethanol side, it uses the starch and sugar. These things are not things you want to be feeding to the animal generally. So it's a very good way to soak up the additional starch and sugar. And then that meal goes back into the supply chain. So there's very good data that shows, that like renewable fuel production can be net positive for calorie generation through protein and other pieces that go into the supply chain. It's hard to talk about food scarcity for humans without pointing out that we now have more diseases from over too many calories than we do too few calories. It's just I have family in India. I go visit the doctor. Dad works in a hospital. It used to be way back in the day, like people coming in because they weren't able to get enough nourishment and calories. And now people are coming in because they're not able to get enough vitamins from the oversupply of bad food that they're eating that's largely starches and sugars. Anyway, bit of a rant there, but we also can't talk about food versus fuel without talking about the 1/3 of food that is wasted at different points in the supply chain. In developed countries, we don't like to eat food that has a blemish on it. So we lose, our food waste occurs closer to the consumer. You know, what's in your fridge right now? Is there anything growing food on it? Maybe. I mean, that's really pervasive in the West. In developing countries, of course, we lose more crops closer to the field. So there's a lot of slack in the global agricultural supply chain that can be tightened up. That is not to dismiss real concerns over food insecurity that exists. The data shows that those are predominantly from extreme poverty, local to conflict, and other things that are not related to overall global supply and demand of calories for nutrition. However, that's a bit of the defensive answer, but the offensive answer is that modern policies must take into account how land is cleared and not permit feedstocks that are from recently cleared land to be eligible, which is why the Canadian Clean Fuel Regulation, it doesn't allow feedstocks in that don't comply with the land use and biodiversity. And please note that that includes palm. Palm is currently an ineligible feedstock under the federal Clean Fuel Regulations because of its land expansion pieces.
Let me just give a quick one to Chris here, again from Robert Parsons. You'll see in the panel there, Chris, in some places like Europe, the GMO, non-GMO distinction is quite important for food oils, veg oils. But what about for hydrogen-derived renewable diesel? Is there no constraint?
There is no constraint. So the reason that Canada has traditionally sold canola to Europe is because of the European biofuel program there, the Renewable Energy Directive. So because it's going into energy and the meal is not under the same level of scrutiny, shall we say, in terms of the GMO issue in Europe, that's how that works in Europe. So there's absolutely no issues selling our canola into the EU market for the purposes of renewable diesel. Same thing as it is with biodiesel today.
That's fine. And now I think I'm just, we're a bit over time here, but I'm just going to finish off with one final question. Chris, the last slides, the last couple of slides, you showed about the changing logistics patterns involving the Western Canadian crush plants. And one of your earlier slides was showing the expansions that are taking place in the crush plants. Places like Yorkton are really getting built up. That northeast corner of Saskatchewan is going to be the home for about 4 or 5 million tons worth of crush, which is that going to exhaust the draw area for canola grown even in that rich canola growing zone of Saskatchewan? And what do you see the implications for the logistics system on the inbound side for these plants?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think when we see not just Yorkton, but we look at the plants that are being built today in Regina and the ones that are still proposed for the Regina area, it's really that southern part of Saskatchewan where we're going to see the big draw. And I think what we're going to see more of, this is something we see already today, but what we're going to see more of is to pull seed by rail from other regions in the prairies to those places where we see a concentration of crush, like you said, in Yorkton alone, up to 4 or 5 million tons of seed crush. So there's going to be a movement by rail, I think, to those types of locations. Again, that happens today to some extent, but it's going to happen likely in a bigger way in the years ahead. We'll continue to purchase, the crush plants will of course continue to purchase local seed, and that's primarily done by truck, but that rail component is going to be a bigger part of the puzzle, shall we say, in the years ahead. Well,
maybe that's a good place to wind up here, Barry. I I think that perhaps a memo for next year, we might invite an old friend of mine, Francois Belanger, who's the head of sustainability for CN, because I've been monitoring his activities, and CN is doing a lot of testing of renewable diesel over the last 2 years in upstate Ohio on testing out these kind of blends and actually high percentages of it. So possibly these trains that are going to go into Regina or into Yorkton are going to be refueling at these locations with renewable diesel as well. So there'll be a direct and indirect effect on this. So I'm going to send it back to you, Barry, at this point.
Thank you very much, Hedley, and thank you, Fred and Chris. This was a great presentation and a great session, and certainly, Fred, to echo your point, so yeah, we could speak a lot more about this, and I think it'll come back up again in the future. It is difficult in a webinar to know what to do with lunch, but I think we should give everybody a chance to have a stretch and break, grab a cup of coffee, and let's return Winnipeg time at 12:25, and we'll hear the farmer's perspective on climate policy. So with that, I will turn this over to our moderator to show our sponsors, and please come back and make sure you join us at 2:25, or sorry, 12:25. Bye for now.